Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and as part of my regular Friday productions and videos, it's normally called Responding to the Critics, and for 29 videos now, I have been reviewing and responding to the book by Gregg entitled Why Not Full Preterism. I apologize. There you go. You see that a little bit better now. I have it folded back so much and making my notes in it and everything, it's difficult to show the whole cover. But anyway, this is video number 13, as just mentioned, and I'm looking at 3 or 4 summary points that Steve makes on pages 165 through 167. Last week was an examination of his first summary point, so let me recommend that you go there and that you take a look at the things that he said. Because, boy, in my estimation, his summary is not very good at all. So, on page 166, we have point number 2 of his summary. And he says, the scriptures distinguish between spiritual resurrection from physical resurrection. John 5:24-29, Revelation 25-6. Placing the first, that is spiritual resurrection, prior to AD 7. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 4, Colossians 3, verse 13. I suspect he meant Colossians 2. 13 there, may be a typo. Anyway, and the second, many centuries later, Revelation chapter 20, verses 7 to 13. Full preterists seem to conflate the two into one event that supposedly happened in AD 70. When Paul refers to spiritual resurrection, he speaks of it as an already existing reality among his readers. He wrote and died before AD 70. If all the benefits of the spiritual resurrection were enjoyed in Paul's own time, what, along such lines, remained to be experienced after AD 70? Well, there's an awful lot of information there that we need to touch on, and I sort of kind of promised myself that I wouldn't go another 30 minutes today. A lot of things going on, but have to see if I can keep this a little bit short. Okay, he says, the scriptures distinguish between spiritual resurrection from physical resurrection. Point number 1, if you remember, and I pointed this out last week, on one page, Steve says that the idea of sin death, covenantal death, is not biblical. Why? Well, because that term never appears in the scripture. And then he turns right around within the next 2 pages and says, well, it's certainly true that there's such a thing as spiritual death. Death being used metaphorically. So on the one hand, he denies the reality of covenantal death, sin death, death through alienation. And on the other hand, he turns right around and says, well, yeah, it's true that the Bible uses the term death metaphorically to speak of separation from God. Well, that's a contradiction. Then Steve says here, the scriptures distinguish between spiritual resurrection from physical resurrection, John 5:24-29. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just simply want to point out, Steve is basing his entire argument here, okay, on the fact that Jesus said, the hour is coming and now is, when the dead shall hear the voice of the Son of Man, then those who hear shall live, and those who hear shall receive everlasting life. Do not marvel at this, verse 28 of John 5, because the hour is coming, in which all who are in the grave shall hear the voice of the Son of Man, and shall come forth, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting condemnation. So Steve says, well, look what we've got here. We have an already, the hour is coming and now is, versus the hour is coming. Well, you see, Steve reasons, as most commentators do, since you have an already resurrection taking place, that's spiritual resurrection, but we're waiting on the hour that was to come, which is at the end of time. the end of the Christian age? Well, first of all, and like I said, there's so much to be noted here, Steve is assuming that these 2 hours are widely separated by centuries and centuries and centuries. And of course, he appeals to that, as proof of that, Revelation chapter 26 and following. After the millennium, the resurrection takes place, according to Steve. Well, that's assuming that there are 2 different kinds of resurrection. Secondly, it ignores the following. The resurrection of Revelation chapter 20, 10 and following, would occur at the time of the judgment. Now, before I make the next point, you have to understand this. Earlier in the book, we saw where Steve acknowledges that time statements of imminence really have to be honored. Well, he evidently saw a train coming on that, realized that might get him in trouble, so he said, time statements of imminence can mean imminent, but maybe not. No, there is no maybe not. When and if the Bible says something was at hand, coming soon, shortly and quickly, there is no if about it unless it's a conditional statement. There is no conditional aspect to the second coming of Jesus Christ, the judgment, the resurrection. So that's a false premise. Secondly, he assumes a difference between kinds of resurrection, spiritual versus physical. That's what he says here on page 166. However, John 5 makes no such distinction. Furthermore, Steve's argument is based upon a changing of God's modus operandi. Here's what I mean by that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 46 and following, Paul said, that which is spiritual is not first, but that which is natural. Well, wait a minute. Steve is reversing the order. Paul said God's modus operandi, and we see this in the typology of the Old Covenant, the typology of the literal physical feast days, for instance, which, by the way, foreshadowed, typified, prophesied the resurrection, but you have a literal physical feast day, Sukkot, foreshadowing the ultimate spiritual resurrection. So God's modus operandi was always natural to spiritual. Steve said, well, that's not the way resurrection is. The way resurrection is first of all, spiritual resurrection, and then at the end of time, millennial removed, we have physical resurrection. Well, like I said, ladies and gentlemen, that's changing horses in midstream, and it's a direct violation of Paul's words. But now back to John chapter 5. And I've got to hurry here. Notice that Jesus said the hour is coming and now is versus the hour that is coming. What Steve is failing to see is this is a Hebraism. A kind of a common saying, to put that another way, to express or to emphasize kind of an already but not yet, but not a widely diverse, widely disparate, widely separated two events. Let me illustrate. In John chapter 4, 20 and following, as Jesus visits and converses with the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, she marvels at who he is and what he has said. And he says, the hour is coming and now is, in which neither in this mountain, Gerizim, or in Jerusalem shall men worship God. Verse 24, the hour is coming in which men will worship God in spirit and in truth. Now let me ask you a question. The time of not worshiping on either Gerizim or Zion, Was that the time that was already present? Or was Jesus saying the time is coming in which men will not worship in a geographically located place? Had that time arrived yet? Well, not technically. Not technically at all. That didn't begin until Acts chapter 2 with the establishment of the church. But again, the point of it is, Jesus said that the hour is coming and now is, in which neither on this mountain or in Jerusalem shall men worship the Father. Okay. So Jesus was predicting the time in which geographically confined worship would no longer be the norm. Right? That time in which geographically confined worship would no longer be the issue, no longer be mandated, is the time when God would have men worship him in spirit and in truth, not on Gerizim, not on Zion. Oh, but wait. Jesus said the hour is coming and now is, in which neither in Jerusalem, not on Zion. And then he said, the hour is coming and is coming. Okay? In which God wants men to worship him in spirit and truth. The point being, ladies and gentlemen, the time of not worshiping on Zion is the time of men worshiping in spirit and in truth, and they were both imminent. The hour is coming, and now is. The hour is coming. But you see, the hour that was coming at the same time as the hour is coming and now is. There is absolutely no temporal dichotomy between the hour is coming and now is and the hour is coming. The hour is coming is simply a reiteration of the hour is coming and now is. And thus Steve's entire paradigm in regard to the then present spiritual resurrection versus a yet future physical resurrection falls in the face of the use of this Hebraism. The Hebraism is not a contrast between two widely separated times and events. Okay, that's more than enough on that. But let's move on just a little bit. And he says that spiritual resurrection was already present. Well, let me remind you one more time. Steve had earlier denied the reality of covenant death, sin death, alienation through sin. And then he turned around and said, well, there is such a thing. And now he's reiterating the fact that the New Testament teaches spiritual resurrection, spiritual death, and spiritual resurrection. But he says, when Paul refers to spiritual resurrection, he speaks of it as an already existing reality among his readers. Well, that's true to a limited extent. All right? It's true in this regard. Notice what Paul says in Romans chapter 6, verse 5 and following. If we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall be also in the likeness of his resurrection. Now, wait a minute. Just hang on a minute. This is something critical. If, that's a conditional statement here, and there are 4 classes of conditions in the Greek, and one of them essentially means if it's true, and it's most assuredly true. It is not, well, if it's true and we don't know it's true or not. No, that's not the meaning of one of these conditional statements in the Greek. Again, one of the conditional statements of Greek is, if it's true and it most assuredly is true. We all know it's true. So, if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death. Well, he's already said that they had joined with Christ in baptism and had been baptized into his death. So he's already affirmed the reality, not the conditionality of whether or not they had been joined with him in the likeness of his death. He had affirmed it unequivocally. That's why this conditional statement in Romans chapter 6 and verse 5 is not a conditional statement at all. He is affirming. Now, if it's true that we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, and it most assuredly is true that we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, buried in baptism in the likeness of his burial. Now, by the way, I think you'll agree with me. I think you will. That Paul is not saying that they had been physically killed, physically buried in a physical tomb. He even says it's the likeness of his death. And furthermore, he says in Romans chapter 6 and verse 16, God be thanked that you were, past tense, the servants of sin, but you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine. Well, what form of doctrine? He had delivered to them the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. They obeyed the form of that truth. Christ's death, burial, and resurrection was assuredly physical. But they did not die physically. They were not physically buried in a hole in the ground. They experienced being buried with Christ by baptism into his death. That's where they entered into the form of his death and burial. And they had been buried with him, to reiterate, by baptism into his death. So now he says in verse 5, if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death. Well, let me reiterate this because it's important. It's not a question of whether or not they had been planted together with Christ in the likeness of his death. That happened when they were baptized. Virtually all scholars agree with this. We shall be, there's a futuristic aspect, in the likeness of his resurrection. Now look, folks, if their death was not a physical death, if their burial was not a physical burial into the ground like Christ was, but simply represented by their burial in water, then where do we get the idea that all of a sudden Paul switches gears and says, okay, you obeyed a form of the doctrine because you were buried with Christ by baptism into his death. You were planted together in the likeness of his death by being baptized into Christ. But that means we're going to be raised out of the physical hole in the ground at the end of time. Well, then that's not a form. That's not the likeness. That's not a metaphor. That's a one-to-one comparison. Jesus died physically, we die physically. He was buried physically, we're buried physically. He arose physically, we must arise physically. But that's not Paul's point. The words that he used point to likeness and point to form. So my point being this, when Steve argues, as he does, that spiritual resurrection was already a current reality in the first century, well, that's true on one level, but that spiritual resurrection that had been initiated was to be consummated. Now, I want to share one more passage, well, maybe two, with you. You know how that goes. This gets aggravating to me in a sort of a way because I get to rolling, okay, and as I get rolling, and I'm turning over to Colossians chapter 3. I hope that you'll join me there in Colossians chapter 3. If then you be risen with Christ, right word raised. Now Paul uses two words for resurrection. anastasis, and digyro. This is one of those words. Now notice he says, you were raised with Christ. That's what he says in Romans chapter 6. Buried with Christ by baptism, wherein also you were raised to walk in newness of life, using the Greek word digyro. The word digyro is used to speak of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Ephesians 1:19 and following. So Paul is using two of his famous words, his well-known words, well-used words, to speak of the fact that the Christians had been buried with Christ by baptism into his death. They had been raised to walk in newness of life. Well, that sounds like done deal, right? Oh, but wait a minute. If then you be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things on the land. More properly, land here. Okay? Now watch this. You died. Now let me ask you a question, folks. How have they died? Oh, they had died with Christ by being baptized into his death. You died. Now, notice that at Paul, 2 Timothy chapter 2, 10 to 12, Paul says, we believe that if we died with him, we shall also live with him. Folks, once again, what is the nature of the death? They had already died. So, in some way, somehow, some sense, doesn't matter if you and I fully comprehend every nuance of it or not, that's the fact. They had already died with Christ. We believe that if we died, past tense, with him, we shall also live with him. Just like Paul in Romans 6, if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, which means they absolutely had been, we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Now continue with me in Colossians chapter 3. For you died, now watch this, your life is hidden with Christ in God. Oh, wait a minute. They're very much physically alive, aren't they? Is their physical life hidden from anybody? When Christ, who is our life, appears, then shall we also appear with him in glory. Therefore, put to death in your members the sins of the flesh, that he lists. I thought they'd already died. No, here he's calling on them to die. Paul, are you confused? You've already said, if then you are risen with, if then you died with Christ. And now he's telling them, put to death the members, the works of the flesh, that are in your members. You mean that you got to keep on dying? Yeah. Dying to the world, dying to sin. Well, Paul, didn't you say in Romans chapter 6 that when they were baptized into Christ, that they did so to put to death the old man of sin? The old body? Yeah, that's what he said. But it wasn't a one-time, for all time reality. They didn't have to keep on being baptized. That began the journey. They had to keep on putting away the sins of the flesh to be sanctified. All of this gets kind of, shall we say, technical. Scholars have recognized the controversies surrounding sanctification and what have you. Well, here are the basic facts, folks. Here are people in Rome, in Ephesians, in Colossians, that Paul says, you died. But he also says to them, Colossians chapter 2 and verse 13, that having been buried with Christ in baptism, they were raised by faith in the power of God. When they were baptized, Paul said, In him, you were circumcised with the circumcision made without hands. Now watch this. In putting off the body of flesh. Now that's a good translation. I understand that many translations say in putting off the sins of the flesh. But it's technically, and many manuscripts support this, in putting off the flesh. Well, wait a minute. When a person is baptized, and that's what Paul's talking about, obviously, buried with Christ by baptism, wherein also you were raised through faith in the operation of God. He's talking about what happened and what happens in baptism. You put off the body or the sin or the flesh. And again, more accurately, you put off the flesh. Wait a minute, aren't we constantly told by futurists? Oh, look, resurrection is when we put off the mortal flesh. Paul said that began when they were baptized into Christ, which is when they were circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, and they put off the flesh. What kind of flesh was that? The sins of the flesh. They put off the mortal body of the sin and the sins of the flesh. Now, again, my whole point here, ladies and gentlemen, is Steve says, well, they had already been raised from the dead. No, it was an ongoing thing. The resurrection that they were looking for, ladies and gentlemen, was to be of the same kind of the death and the burial that they had experienced. But Paul says the kind of death and burial that they had experienced, submitted themselves to, was a likeness of the death and the burial. It was a form of the death and the burial. And that means that the future life, if we've been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. That means that the likeness of the resurrection would not be a one-to-one, but it would be a representative. We would say it's a spiritual thing. Just like being or dying with him, spiritual death. That doesn't mean they were alienated from God. They died to the world. But they joined his death. Just like we today, if we're baptized, we join with him in his death. That's the only power. And I won't get off into baptism. People say, oh, it's a work of man. No, it's not. It's a work of God. The power of baptism is faith. The power of baptism is God doing the raising. And God putting us into the power of Jesus' death and burial and resurrection. It's really quite beautiful when we think about it, if we're willing to be challenged in this way. But again, final thought. What Steve is saying is spiritual resurrection already done, completed, over in the first century. We're waiting on physical. That reverses the order of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 when Paul says the natural, we would call that physical, is first, and then the spiritual. Should we take a doctrine that reverses God's modus operandi, just reverses it 180 out, and say, that's the Christian doctrine? And secondly, when Paul says the resurrection, spiritual resurrection was already an accomplished reality in the first century, no, he is denying the very, very clear use of Hebraism in John chapter 5, 24 to 29, which means that the hour that was coming and now is in Jesus' day was the identical hour of the hour that is coming. They were not widely separated in time. And it means that the life that the Romans, the Corinthians, the Ephesians, the Colossians had been baptized into, and that they were awaiting for its revelation. You know, you died and your life, and let me reiterate this, you died and your life is hidden. Folks, look, their physical life was not in any way, shape, form, or fashion hidden. Is that not self-evident? But Paul says the death they died was unknown. We could say that. And the life which they had received had not been manifested. Closing point. I've used a whole 30 minutes here. Their resurrection had begun, and they had been given the Holy Spirit as not the down payment, but as the guarantee, the arrabon, of the completion of that resurrection, which had begun when they were baptized into Christ, raised to walk in newness of life, to await their being raised in the likeness of Jesus's resurrection. Listen, I've got a whole lot more on Steve's concepts about death and about spiritual death and physical death. And next week, I will look at his point number 3 of his summary, and I want to show you some incredible, absolutely incredible, blatant contradictions. Now look, in the meantime, do not forget, since we're talking resurrection, okay, let me urge you, go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, go to the top of the page. There's a banner there for my 2 books, very large books, as you can tell, over 400 pages each. We shall meet him in the air of the wedding of the King of Kings, that's resurrection, and the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, fulfilled or future. If you want to understand a whole lot more, with a whole lot more clarity, the doctrine of biblical resurrection, go there, order these 2 books. If you purchase them separately, they would cost you $57 plus. The rest of this month, it's almost gone, folks. The rest of this month, August 2023, U.S. orders only, total delivered price, $45. Okay, I'm out of time. I'm way out of time. Thanks for joining me. Don't forget, join Mike Sullivan and me tomorrow as we continue our examination of Doug Wilson's attack on covenant eschatology. I will see you there.